Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Why Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and here in Canada, well, we saw this news, make headlines for just a little while. We covered it, but we now want to take a look at what it actually means when it comes down to the numbers, and that is with the federal government and the BC government have announced a plan to purchase 2,200 unsold condominium units and convert them into affordable housing as a part of an effort to address Canada's housing shortage. So now the units are primarily located in Metro Vancouver, where they're seeing where, there's slowing sales numbers as well as high interest rates and what is essentially a weaker buyer demand that have left developers with completely and completed condos that are unsold inventory. So here you have a case where developers built up the skyscrapers and people didn't buy it. And we know Vancouver is the most expensive place to live in all of Canada. And second to that is Toronto. So this is one of the most expensive cities in all of Canada. And there is so much inventory of finished condominiums that just are left vacant. And so now the greater question is that should taxpayer dollars go to bail out these developers who've footed up the bill to be able to build all these out and not be able to close in time and not have that much demand? So their projections were definitely off when they decided to put these high-rise buildings into place. So now you have this situation where this project, completed, it's vacant, and now the government's saying that they hope that this program of using taxpayer dollars to bail out the developers will provide immediate affordable housing and essentially inject, liquidity into construction sector to get that going again in British Columbia. Now, officials say that this incentive will also prevent additional housing projects from being canceled due to financing pressure. So you have this situation where there's the bailout happening at the same time, and it's a way to be able to offer affordable housing, but it was built for a certain type of living standards. So this is a time where and then what do you charge the people to live in the affordable housing, or is that going to be more aid to be able to create affordable housing? And this is in one of the most expensive cities in all of Canada. So now this estimated cost to the taxpayers is $1 billion to $1.4 billion. So that's a very significant chunk that the federal government is putting towards this entire project. And so the purchase will be for 2,200 units. So that approximately puts the cost of per unit at $455,000 to up to $635,000. So, in given standards, in Toronto, that's still something that is available for purchase for those prices. So when you do the comparable, how much cheaper is it than what it would cost to actually be there? Is it half the price that the government is able to purchase it for, given of the location it's in? So this is something that is also critical. And what does it plan on doing when it makes it and converts it into affordable housing? And who's really paying for that? Is it going to be more subsidies? Or do they have lower rent? So this is a entire model that we're looking to see more information from the government. But this construction employs roughly of what's taken place as they're projecting significant amount of Canadians. So now the housing affordability has become one of the largest economic concerns here in Canada, where you have the government increasingly willing to spend billions that we're seeing in this case to increase housing supply. But when it comes to taxpayers, they expect those investments to produce long-term public value, not just convert, condominiums into, in this case, affordable housing. So now the success of this program, it won't be measured by how many condos government buys, but by whether it creates affordable homes without distorting what would be Canadians' housing market future. Will that change the shape of what it means for those communities and what would be the projected construction for other housing? And also the question remains that if you're buying it at 500,000, and then next to there's condominiums going up for 1.2, 1.3. How does that distort the pricing of the market? Because essentially the market's priced based on the real estate value of the neighborhood. So here you have it where Canada's facing this shortfall estimate of about 3.5 to 5 million homes by 2030. And when it comes to Metro Vancouver, it remains like one of the most desired neighborhoods where it has the least affordable housing there. So this is something that we're watching in terms of what it means for this project, how successful is it going to be, and how much effect it's going to have in the housing market. Now, when it comes to the pesticides law, we announced this not too long ago, the changes that the federal government has made. But now there's the latest concern that it's raising Canada and European Union trade concerns because Canada has passed legislation giving federal regulators greater flexibility when approving pesticide use. And so this move has had supporters say that it will improve efficiency and improve farmers with better access to crop protection products. But when it comes to critics, they're saying that, these changes would complicate agriculture trade with the European Union and generally apply stricter pesticide laws and regulations compared to the rest of the world. So this new legislation is something that has been updated just very recently under Prime Minister Mark Carney's slim majority government. And this has to do with the pesticides approval process. Now, the government says that the reforms improve what would be, a flexibility in the regulations. And this is to be able to make sure that, as you can see, that's pesticide. Farm groups, largely support faster approvals for this. But when it comes to environmental organizations, they're saying that, this is a massive rollback on oversight. And the European Union remains some of the world's strictest pesticide concerns. And so Canada exports billions of dollars of agriculture products annually. And this is significant because then there is the difference between organic products and the non-organic. So when it comes to the Canada-EU trade agreement, the CETA, it significantly expanded agriculture trade, which is really important for Canada's exports because the agriculture contribute more than $140 billion annually to Canada's GDP. So Canada cannot be in a position where it's going to lose a potential trade agreement because of its lowered regulations. So now Canadian farmers rely on international markets significantly to be able to produce a lot of crops and for not only just domestic use, but for exports. So if pesticide standards are different and significantly from the European regulations, then exporters will face additional challenges when it comes to inspections, compliance, costs, and of course, it would be for market access that would become much more challenging. So this highlights this increasingly difficult balance between food production and environmental protection, as well as trade concerns for Canadians. And in the United States, President Trump got a good news because the Supreme Court has now ruled that asylum seekers may be turned around. They've sided with the president on this issue. They've delivered yet another major immigration victory for President Trump, ruling that the asylum seekers may be turned away before entering the U.S. territory. So now this decision clears the way for the U.S. President Trump administration to revive its controversial broader metering policy, if you recall this, which limits how many migrants can access asylum each day at official ports of entry, really standardizing it all throughout. And supporters for this are essentially arguing that the policy gives broader border officials greater control over immigration flows, as well as reduce pressure and overwhelm on the entire immigration system. Because when you have a flow of migrants crossing, then their time to be able to get their applications processed would be a lot more delayed because of the overwhelming pressure on the entire immigration system, but also means that there's going to be a gap of them being in the country and not really having their needs addressed. And so you have this situation where now critics are also saying that it undermines this long-standing asylum protection, and this could leave vulnerable migrants stranded in dangerous conditions. In this case, the migrants that should cross to safety would be in dangerous territories, which is the reason why they actually wanted to leave those areas. So you have this entire debate between the two sides, but now the Supreme Court has ruled, and this would be in favor. They voted 6-3 on this issue, so they are now, this victory is for President Trump. Now, more than 3 million migrants encounters were recorded at the southern border in 2025. So just last year alone, the asylum law essentially goes back to 1980 Refugee Act, and it's aligned with international refugee protections. Now, this decision gives the executive branch broader authority over how asylum claims are processed and is expected to reshape what would be a broader operations immediately, since the Supreme Court has now given the green light. So it also signals that the Supreme Court is willing to grant the administration considerable discretion when it comes to immigration enforcement, which goes to show you how those 6 judges essentially feel about the American immigration system. Because immigration has become one of the defining political issues in the United States. And if you recall, there was about 20 million illegal migrants in the United States during the time of President Joe Biden. This is something President Trump campaigned heavily on to get his reelection for his second term. And so this has become a massive issue. And if you recall, President Trump made it his main issue in his first term when he talked about building the border, building the wall at the border of United States and Mexico. So this is showing that this ruling is reflecting what would be a broader shift in how the courts are going to interpret executive powers when it comes to border security and immigration. Because for decades, you have the United States asylum laws have been based on the principle that people who are fleeing persecution have the right to request protection once they reach the border. That's been the law in the United States. And now the legal debate has never been whether there should be asylum exits, but rather when and how that right can be exercised. So now the supporters of this are arguing that this asylum system has been overwhelmed. And at times they're saying that, it's been taken advantage of through certain entry points, and creating years of backlogs, and essentially encouraging migrants to travel through certain borders, whether it's through the north or the south, knowing that there might be, a way that they can get in and wait for a long-term hearing, and believing that maybe, the border control isn't as strict, and not implementing some of these strategies. And now that's going to change the way things are done according to this new Supreme Court ruling. And President Trump has also demanded voter ID bill before signing the House package. This is significant because President Trump is refusing to sign a bipartisan housing package unless Congress first advances what he calls the Save America Act legislation that would require the proof of U.S. citizenship and voter identification in federal elections. For a long time, we've had President Trump say that the election he lost to President Joe Biden was stolen from him. He said that there was issues when it comes to people not having to prove that they're American citizens prior to voting. And so this is something that he wants to make mandatory. So this move has delayed legislation. It's because he's tied it to what would be for housing supply and affordability, and essentially said, I want this bill passed through, and essentially that way we can do what you need to do when it comes to the House. This is important because this is something he's campaigned on, and I think most people would agree that you want, if the law says that only citizens can vote in an election, that there should be some sort of proof that when they get to the polling location, that they can show their ID, that they say who they are, to be able to access a ballot, to be able to vote. So now the housing bill does include billions aimed at expanding affordable housing And so the federal law has already prohibited non-citizens from voting in the federal election, but now this is aimed at him saying, I'll give you the housing affordability part if you give me this voter ID part. So this is quite significant because it's going to go through and it's going to create a situation for the future federal election to be in less, suspicion of what actually took place in certain areas. For example, in California, they removed the law to have to show ID. And so that was a very significant challenge of what's taken place in California. So now if it's a federal rule, then that would override the entire situation. And on top of that, you have President Trump who's seeking about $88 billion for a few things. And on that list of $88 billion, he is asking for money for Iran. He's asking money for farmers and for Ebola response. So President Trump has asked Congress to approve this big bill of nearly $88 billion in emergency supplemental funding covering military operations related to the conflict with Iran that was going on for 3 months, financial assistance for American farmers affected by global trade disruptions. That was the case because of the Iran conflict, and the expanded funding for Ebola preparedness. We saw the Ebola rates hike not too long ago, so this is a response to that. So the request has been drawn, mixed reactions because he clumped up a few things together: Iran, farmers, and Ebola response and preparedness. So now some Republicans support the national security spending while others are questioning about adding billions to an already very large federal deficit, because this actually does need this $88 billion that the president's asking for does need congressional approval. It is absolutely required and mandatory. So now when you look at the key stats of what the United States situation is, their national debt exceeds $37 trillion. They have an annual federal deficit that remains above $1 trillion. So this emergency spending request often becomes a very huge political battle because they combine what would be urgent priorities with concerns about government debt and long-term fiscal sustainability. So now this supplemental funding bill has become increasingly common during wars we've seen take place that the United States have been involved in, or maybe in natural disasters or public health emergencies, because what it does is it allows the government to quickly respond without waiting for the next annual budget. So that's why it's called an emergency. But the challenge here is that these packages often combine unrelated priorities into the bill, right? So here's an emergency money that I need because we need to spend on XYZ, but let me insert some other things in there to get the money out faster. And why get the money out faster? It is a midterm election year. It's only months away. It's in November, and he's asking for money to be released and not have to wait till next year until there's a budget for it. So now when it comes to military funding, agricultural assistance, and public health preparedness, each have different political constituencies, and he's clumping it all in one. But essentially he's saying that, hey, this is the total cost and these are the reasons. So you have fiscal conservatives that are arguing that this repeated emergency spending is definitely contributing to America's growing debt burden, while the supporters are saying that, you know what, if you delay actions, it could even create a greater cost later when it comes to American farmers, or because they've had challenges because of supply disruptions, or when it comes to this Ebola preparedness that they need to get ahead of. So investors will also watch whether additional government spending adds inflationary, if it adds to the inflation numbers and pressure on inflation at the same time when they're seeing prices remain quite elevated, because $88 billion is quite a sum to be asking for in an emergency funding. And the name that we keep hearing about that is continuously taking place is Jeffrey Epstein. And now we have the members of the House Oversight Committee. They're considering subpoenaing related to a confidential settlement involving Jeffrey Epstein's associates and alleged victims. So lawmakers are essentially now examining whether non-disclosure agreements prevented witnesses from sharing information with investigators. Now, the congressional subpoena could require testimony even if witnesses previously signed NDAs, which would be confidentiality agreements. Now, the committee is continuing examining the Epstein-related matters. So now Jeffrey Epstein died back in 2019 while awaiting trial. If you recall, he took his own life, and that was what was said at the time. And so now multiple civil settlements have been reached over the past several years. We saw that take place with Virginia Guthrie, and if you recall, um, former Prince Andrew. And that was one of the settlements. There have been many other settlements that have taken place, but now this congressional subpoena can compel sworn testimony. So why this is important is because the investigation could bring new testimony into one of the most scrutinized criminal cases in like the entire history of the world, because what the Jeffrey Epstein files released was really shock. And it was not just a criminal case, but it was like a cultural shock of all the people who he was connected to and the types of activities that was taking place and how many people actually knew about it and who were the victims and who were the actual people who were also part of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal activities has always been the question around the release of his emails and everything that has come out from the Jeffrey Epstein trial, as well as Ghislaine Maxwell's trial. So now there's renewed questions about accountability for individuals connected to Jeffrey Epstein, because if you recall, just not long ago, weeks ago, over a month ago, you had First Lady Melania Trump say Jeffrey Epstein did not act alone. She had a surprise press conference that the president said he didn't know anything about. And in that, she says Jeffrey Epstein did not act alone. And the reason she had that press conference was for her to say that she, is not connected to him in any way, and that her and her husband knew him because they run in certain circles when it comes to Florida and New York, and he's happened to be in the vicinity of the same circles. Regardless of the emails that came out between her and Ghislaine Maxwell. But this is something that, now you have the House looking at about what is the connection between these settlements. Why were there settlements with witnesses? We need to know what's going on and who actually were accomplices to Jeffrey Epstein. It couldn't have just been Ghislaine Maxwell, right? She was his accomplice, but who were the other people that partook in the criminal activity of exploiting young underage women and the sex trade and everything else that Jeffrey Epstein has been accused of. So this is nearly 7 years after Jeffrey Epstein's death. So now the case continues to generate still a lot of political and public interest around it because there's so many questions that have remained unanswered. So now Congress is not reopening Epstein's criminal case, but what they're seeking to do right now is they want to examine whether confidential settlements and legal agreements prevented information from becoming public or reaching investigators. And that's important because if those settlements were made and money was sent to keep everyone quiet and get them to sign, NDA where they're not allowed to talk about it, that would essentially impede the investigation into knowing what happened with Jeffrey Epstein's. So now one of the central legal questions involves the non-disclosure agreements, the NDAs, essentially because they'll limit parties of what they can discuss publicly, and generally, in this case, what they plan on doing is to make sure that it does not override a lawful congressional subpoena. This will be very interesting to see how it unfolds because if witnesses are compelled to testify under oath, new information could emerge despite previous settlement agreements. And that's going to be shocking when that's released. And so that is something that we're watching about these subpoenas, what's going to ultimately take place, who will be subpoenaed, and what would they have to say in terms of being able to disclose, even though they got paid, there was a settlement, and they signed an NDA. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.